Antifa, short for anti-fascists, is a movement that experts say doesn't have any rigid structure or real leader. Security experts say that what they do know is people who identify themselves as Antifa in the US is a relatively small group, as few as a dozen people in a given city.
Antifa ranges all the way from nonviolent progressives, this is important, who are deeply troubled by the racism and violence and vacuum with regard to addressing it here in the United States and around the world, all the way over to violent people who believe there's a siren call to eliminate not only bigotry, but institutions that they think are connected to oppression, which includes journalists, which include governments. But for the most part now, they are focused on confronting white supremacists, neo-Nazis, xenophobes, and people who they regard as such or their supporters. The problem is it's an elastic pool of people who share very different philosophies about how to confront bigotry and systemic racism, and then what to do with society in that midst. At the most hardest edge, it does embrace violence as a tactic.
People identifying themselves as Antifa were spotted at several protests in the US, wearing black clothes and behaving aggressively, the police and journalists. But research suggests that when it comes to political violence, far-left groups are not often the problem. A University of Maryland study found 12% of all terrorist attacks in the US between 2010 and 2016 were committed by left-wing groups, while 35% were instigated by the far right. In early June, President Trump sought to brand Antifa as a terrorist organization. However, legal experts explain the federal government doesn't have the legal authority to do so.
It's diverse, but it's not a group. And you need two things right now under American law. You need an actual group, and you also need some connection to an international nexus. That's just not my opinion. That's what the federal law is. And right now, we don't have that. But bottom line is, it's not a group. It's a broad philosophy.
According to the data of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, in 2019, white supremacists and far-right people committed 26 homicides. People who identify as Antifa have not committed any such crimes, at least in the last 3 years, according to the same data. Other researchers say any attempt to label Antifa as a terrorist group would mean other groups would also qualify on the right and left.
I guess in some instances you could call Antifa a terrorist group, but then again, if you did that label, then you would have to start giving terrorist groups. So you have to label environmentalists, you'd have to animal rights, and then on the right, you would have to start labeling the Ku Klux Klans, Aryan Nations, World Church of the Creator, those types of organizations. So. And a lot of it goes back to that we don't really have a structured definition of what is domestic terrorism.
And if Antifa were an organized group, their tactics do not really rise to the level of terrorism, says a professor at the Washington State University who studies social movements.
I'd say Antifa is maybe 1 or 2% of the typical progressive or left protests, and they are not particularly well-liked by the majority of nonviolent protesters. They engage in a certain degree of vandalism. They sometimes have engaged in fistfights or slug matches with right-wing protesters, but they have not done anything that's particularly violent in the way that would allow them to be designated as terrorists, as the administration has attempted to do recently.
The Federal Bureau of Investigation monitors several groups that they consider potential threats. The list includes sovereign citizens and white supremacy groups and animal rights groups and anarchists. Anusha Vitisyan for VOA News, Washington.